preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Laura Kaminsky, Associate Director of Education, and I'd like to welcome you to the Y for the third evening of our series, Critics on Criticism, Theater. I'd like to also remind you that there is to be no photography, no picture taking, and no tape recording during the evening. The format tonight is the usual. Following the moderated conversation on stage, you will have an opportunity to submit your questions written on the index cards you received upon entering the hall. In about 45 minutes, the ushers will come down the hall, down the aisles, collect your cards, and bring them backstage for presentation. Our guest tonight is Jack Kroll, Newsweek senior editor since 1964, the magazine's drama and film critic since 1967, and currently serving as critic-at-large, writing in the cultural sections. A graduate of City College, Mr. Kroll worked for several years as an advertising copywriter with Benton and Bowles here in New York. In 1960, he joined the staff of Art News, which he left in 1963 to join Newsweek. Jack Kroll has been a frequent guest at the 92nd Street Y, and we are particularly pleased to be able to present, once again, one of the most penetrating observers and critics of American culture. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Jane Moss, and our guest, Jack Kroll. Thank you.
Penetrating observer. Okay, we're all going downstairs and listen to Linda Hunt. Just follow me.
First, we'll see how good you are.
Okay, fair enough.
Before I start this evening's interview, I just have one very brief anecdote to relate, which is that yesterday afternoon I was speaking to my brother on the phone, and my brother is a very unique person in that he is 30 years old. He is, by anybody else's definition, a yuppie, and he attends the theater quite frequently, which is a very unique combination. And I was talking to him about this series and talked to him about past participants, and he said, I think what you really need is a really influential critic like Jack Kroll. And he said that totally unsolicited on my part. So I am very pleased to be interviewing Jack Kroll this evening.
You're right, your brother's unique.
My first question to you is that I think my brother's comment indicates that a Newsweek review can play a powerful role in determining the future life of a production. I think all of us here are, if anything, overly aware of the power of the New York Times and the kind of pressure that can be brought to bear on the first-string critic of the New York Times. And I was wondering if you felt a similar pressure and whether that pressure in any way affected your reviews.
I think the main effect of a Newsweek review these days is to upset the editors of Newsweek, who will more often than not say, "Why are you writing about that stuff? Only 39 people in the whole world care about it." So I don't know about that. No, I think that the New York Times has unique, absolute power almost in this business. It's always been that way, and it increases. That power increases year by year. A very bad situation.
And you don't think that by virtue of being, if anything, more of a national publication than the New York Times, that sort of compensates for the power of the New York Times, perhaps not so much with the New York audience, but with the tourist audience?
Well, you see, the New York theater is in New York, obviously, and the market is concentrated here. So the fact that Newsweek and Time are national magazines is, I don't think, as important as it perhaps ought to be. You like to think, and I think it once was true, that the national magazines had a kind of cultural, intellectual importance, speaking to a national audience, to people around the country who are interested in theater. But in recent years, when the bottom line has become so all-important all through journalism, and especially in cultural journalism, this audience that I'm talking about around the country is being turned away from more and more by the people who run the big mass media publications. And that's a very serious
Do you have to
situation.
sort of fight with your editors for more space, or for space specifically for theater? Or are you in competition with other departments of Newsweek for space?
All of those things are true. Fight with editors for space is the name of the game week after week. You know, you drag yourself out of bed on Monday, groaning, literally, schlep your way into the office because you know the weekly fight does start. Since you're asking about this, a little anecdote may not be amiss. Over the weekend, I heard that my review of the new Neil Simon play had been knocked out of the magazine because they needed
He was on the cover of Time.
We knew about that. I'll come to that in a moment. But because they needed 600 more columns to do the weekly Iranian story, which obviously is very important news, it's in time to. And so they looked through the magazine and they said, where can we find more of course, theater, Not theater, but theater, And so it's a new Neil Simon play. So, And we also knew that Time was doing a cover, and because of that, we did our Neil Simon cover some years ago, ho, ho, ho. So we feel way ahead of them. And in fact, knowing that Time
When he was an aspiring playwright.
That's right. I had sort of mentioned that fact in my review. Very clever of me to have done that, wasn't it? Saying in a Newsweek cover story some years ago, Neil Simon said, quote, But you see, now when I came into work today, feeling extremely depressed, I had an absolutely terrible weekend because I had been given this information. I was upset and angry and furious and all those things. And only the victory of the New York Giants over the Washington Redskins had, partially counteract that. That's real theater. And when I came into the office this morning, I was about to send the review over to the producer's office because I thought it's, the opening of a new Simon play, and especially a kind of innovative one like this is if that's not cultural news, I don't know what is. And I was quite embarrassed by it. And I was about to send the piece over to the producers just to show that we did indeed do it, when I picked up the magazine and lo and behold, it was in. And so I found out that they had obtained their 5,000 columns on Iran by some other device.
Now, is theater discriminated against more frequently than movies or the other arts? Or is the whole area of cultural reporting suspect?
The situation at the moment is such that your question is like asking which among the Indian untouchables is most untouchable. It might be theater, but the pressure is so extreme all across the board culturally that it almost makes you feel better. But it's the live performing arts that in particular are being looked at askance by bottom line people in mass journalism, mass audience journalism.
And there are no sorts of statistics that can demonstrate that people are going to buy Newsweek because it has this kind of section included in it?
There are boatloads of statistics, and the evidence that comes in from readers almost every week is extraordinary. It's a marvelous example that can only be appreciated, I think, by satirists of genius like Jonathan Swift. It's a fabulous example of not paying attention to precisely the factors that you, in fact, insist that you are paying attention to, you see. Everyone knows that there is a tremendous audience out there. I remember one occasion, for example, when we were trying to do a theater cover story, I forget what the subject was, and everyone was dead against it. And that particular week happened to be a week in which our bureau chiefs from around the country were in New York for some kind of conference. And so everyone thought, aha, we'll ask the bureau chiefs how they feel about this. And of course they'll say, well, who gives a damn about the New York theater out in Houston and Oshkosh? And to everyone's amazement, not mine, the bureau chief said, well, yeah, there's tremendous interest among our readers in this, And so they couldn't use that as a cover.
As ammunition.
I think the real situation, well, when I was down in Louisville not too long ago, where the Actors Theater of Louisville has been one of the most important and enterprising regional theaters for many years, specializing, in fact, in new American plays. Every year they do a festival of new American plays, and they've built an amazing audience, almost pulling that audience up by their bootstraps. Tremendous resistance initially on the part of that audience, which really wanted to see the classic and the old turkeys and so forth. And year after year, John Jory, the guy who runs the Actors Theater in Louisville, actually built that audience by sheer force of will almost. And now they're very proud of that operation. So you would think that Louisville is a kind of bastion of forward-looking activity in culture. And also they've got tremendous corporate support from the big companies that are down there. Well, one year when I was down there, I read the most amazing letter in, I guess, the Courier. And it said, it was the lead letter in the letter section in the Sunday paper, and it said, "At last we have a president in this country, Mr. Reagan, who is going to put all of you cultural elitists in your place. All of you wise guys who love," and I'm almost quoting word for word, "the live performing arts," and then proceeded to list them: theater, opera, ballet, symphony concerts. Everything was listed except television and movies. At last we have a president who's not going to give you money, who's not going to cater to your elitist whims. It's about time. And I thought, isn't that interesting that this becomes the lead letter in a newspaper in, of all places, Louisville, which of all American towns is noted for precisely this sort of thing. And it was a pretty scary letter because you got the feeling that it was not an isolated crank outburst, but it spoke for a large constituency in this country, which for some interesting complex of psychological reasons has the hates for the live performing arts. And this constituency now they have their unelected representatives in many of the people who run our huge journalistic enterprises and who think exactly the same thing.
You are the only participant who is really writing for a national and very broad-based audience. Do you have a difficult time identifying who you are writing for? Whom you are writing for, I'm sorry.
There's this little guy that I met years ago that I keep hidden in my office. He's the fellow. Actually, it's a girl, but if I say that, it won't sound right. No, you don't really know who you're writing for. You're writing for some idealized version of yourself. It's not the self that is this self. God forbid it should be this self. But it's some idealized
self
version of yourself. If you were not only you, but also out there, somewhere. If you weren't just if you didn't have the bad fortune to be a born and bred New Yorker, but were also, in some mysterious metaphysical way, a creature of the outlands, If you weren't just educated the way you were, but also had another kind of education. A kind of idealized and more comprehensive version of yourself. Someone who cares about stuff, who really isn't satisfied to be spoon-fed or fork-fed or hand-fed, the stuff that is being dished out, but really wants to break through the conventional ideas, the received ideas, and to think a little about it and to know where things fit in, and not, in other words, not what I think or what any one person really thinks. What you try to do, I think, what you should try to do, it's a very difficult thing to do, is not to think that your own opinion about something is the most important thing, but to try to cast that opinion in some more general mode so that you lead someone to a sense of the experience, because most of the people who read you are not going to have the experience. They're not going to see the Simon play. They're not going to see maybe the David Byrne movie. They're not going to see the Twyla Tharp dance. You want to give them a sense not only of what it is in physical fact, but why it is. What's it doing there? Who asked for it? Where did it come from? How would things be if it didn't exist? Now that it's here among us, how would it change us, or does it change us? I think, is...
It's interesting you should say that, because when Frank Rich was here last year, he said that he viewed one of his primary functions as being that of a reporter. in really communicating the event to the readership?
I think it's more than being a reporter. Reporter is a very important part of it, but if it's just going to be that, it's not nearly enough. It's got to be the kind of reporting that contains meanings and significances and leads you not only to oh, so that's what happened, but oh yeah, isn't that interesting? I never thought of that, you see. That's really what you need. So it goes beyond reporting, I think. I think Frank is being overly modest, you see. So aware that he has the power in this town, you see, that he tries to cut that down by saying, I'm only a reporter. But of course, if you actually read what he writes and what he has to write, we know what reporting is. What he is giving us is much more than reporting. When he says, for example, a couple of days ago that the new Neil Simon play is messy, but both in the positive and negative senses, this is more than reporting, I think. And it has to be more than reporting. But I know what he means. He's trying, in his way, to say what I've been trying to say, that it's not your opinion that's most important, but it's something else. It's something that goes beyond that.
I just have one more sort of essentially quick question about your editors, which is, do you perceive that situation as getting worse? Or have...
Are any editors here tonight? Getting worse?
We had
Yeah.
Poindexter checking them at the door.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So they're all here.
I think we're about to hire him, actually, for... No. Do I think it's getting worse? Yeah, I think it probably is going to get worse for the simple or not so simple reason that... And again, I'm talking... You see, the unfortunate thing is that we're talking about, I guess, the arts or culture, whatever you want to call it, and we're talking about cultural journalism because I guess if I'm anything, that's what I am. But there's much more to the operation of a news magazine or a newspaper than that. And the really strange and unfortunate thing is that what's been created is the kind of schizophrenic organism where the so-called front of the book, the so-called hard news, political news, the kind of thing we're being treated to every day now, which God knows is all important and crucial.
And very theatrical.
And very theatrical is right. But you see, the attitude toward that is that let's do it on the highest possible level, at the highest level of intelligence. Let's not reduce it to the lowest common denominator. I mean, how could you possibly want to do that? You see, that's the proper way to do it. Okay, so much for that. Then you suddenly turn to what is not so laughingly anymore called the back of the book, and the attitude changes remarkably. Instead of, and let's handle this stuff at the same highest possible level of intelligence, and let's not reduce that to the lowest common denominator. No, exactly the opposite. Let's look for the lowest common denominator. What's the latest teeny bopper movie? What's going to make $400 million? Is it Rodney Dangerfield meets Steve Spielberg? And that's not that. I mean, these things are terrific. We should, but this is the schizophrenic nature of the enterprise now, where the front is considered the province of intelligence, of the highest possible analytical approach, and the back, culture with a capital K, well, let's go easy on that. What about this guy, Robert Wilson? Now, wait a second now. What did you say he does? You mean to say he brings a cardboard elephant across the stage and then he was a homeless? Well, now, how many people are really going to be interested in that, you see?
Do you get to choose the productions that you review?
Yeah. The reason that I'm reacting this way is that some time ago I would have given a very vehement yes to your question. Now it's not vehement. It's sort of V, without the ament, Yeah, I suppose so. Only because with certain limitations. Sure. Yeah. Within the context of fighting for everything.
It's a unique context.
Yeah.
You, more than any other critic almost, gets to see a great deal and of theater outside of New York and has a great deal of sort of firsthand experience of theater outside of New York. And the series so far has concentrated almost exclusively on New York theater. And I would love to hear some of your, and yet those of us in New York get fairly defensive when we keep hearing about this wonderful regional theater that somehow never comes to New York. And I'm just curious as to your observations of the theater world outside of New York.
Okay, I have news for everybody. Relax about outside of New York. Don't have to worry about it so much. Okay, it's a wisecrack, but there's a lot of truth to it. I guess this year, I think, is a kind of informal anniversary marking roughly 25 years of the regional theater movement, if you can, locate it and put a time scale on it. If you date it, I guess, from the founding of the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis by Tyrone Guthrie, that's one way of doing it. But in any case, it's roughly a quarter century that we've had a sort of...
It's been up and running.
Yeah, a focused, something that we all know as the regional theater movement. And in that quarter century, gee, come to think of it, it's exactly the same amount of time that Neil Simon's been writing plays.
That's interesting.
Sort of amazing.
That actually is interesting.
I don't know what they have to do with one another. Anyway, so for 25 years, we've had a regional theater movement which has been through an amazing number of ups and downs and tremendous optimism, and then sort of dirty little secret of pessimism, because you're not supposed to blow the whistle on the regional theater, and then up and then down and then up and then down. I think at the present moment, and I don't pretend to have visited every regional theater in the last several years, but if you sample stuff here and there and you talk to people, even more importantly, you get a sense of what's going on. And there's a crisis in the regional theater too. There really is. What we in New York have noticed in recent years is that to the degree that there is any serious theater in New York, it's coming in from the regional theaters. And this is not the way it used to be here. The serious American plays used to be developed right here in New York. That hasn't been true for a very long time. But now, if you carry that thought further and realize that when I say to the degree that there is serious theater in New York, that degree has shrunk to almost zero. Now, at the present moment, I think there are two, I've got my statistics in here, but...
There are two American plays on Broadway at the moment.
That's right. Simon's play, which is just
and
opened,
Social Security.
And Social Security, absolutely, and that's about it, So, but to round off that question, my impression of the regional theater at the moment is that it too is going through almost as big or as big a crisis of economics, confidence, creativity, confusion about purpose. You look, for example, at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, which for most of that quarter century was the anchor, was the bellwether. That was, and symbolically or not so symbolically, right smack in the middle of the country, so they couldn't say, oh, well, New York, oh, well, Los Angeles. Tyrone Guthrie, when he came here, deliberately wanted to found his theater in the heartland of the country. He wanted to get away from all the coastal stuff, you see. And for a hell of a long time, that was the diamond of the whole operation. From Guthrie to Michael Langham and on to others. Now, in the last few years, they've gone from one artistic director to another. They have lost their focus. They don't quite know what they're doing, the kind of work they should be putting on. The last to feel this was Olivio Ciule, the brilliant Romanian director who's worked all over the world, was brought in with a lot of fanfare a couple of years ago, did wonderful work, fascinating work, but no, that wasn't it. And before him, Alvin Epstein, who was brought in from the Yale Repertory Theater. No, that wasn't it. And when the Guthrie Theater loses its confidence and goes into that state of confusion, you know that there's something wrong with the entire regional theater movement as a whole. Gordon Davidson at the Mark Taper Forum in Los Angeles, one of the most successful operations and one of the most successful directors in the country, recently took a whole year off just to figure out what the hell is going on and what ought I to be doing. It just recently has come back. Interestingly enough, the Guthrie recently tried to hire away John Jory, the man I mentioned who's running the Actors Theater in Louisville. And he almost succumbed to that lure. I didn't think it was a good idea. I thought when they asked me to sort of think about this, and my opinion was that they were going to ruin two theaters by doing this, that they would ruin Louis by losing John, and he would go to Guthrie, and he wouldn't be able to succeed any more than anybody else has. Part of the crisis is also economics. So the regional theater movement, I think, is gasping for oxygen almost as strongly as New York and Broadway is at the moment.
It also seems to me that I would agree that Broadway is certainly an artistic desert by and large at the moment, but I think off-Broadway continues to supply a remarkable degree of plays to the regional theater as opposed to importing them from the regional theater.
Yeah, there's much more life on off-Broadway and off-Broadway, if those labels still mean anything. That's true. And in fact, we don't realize, I suppose, that we have a regional theater right here in New York, of course, and that's the off-Broadway theater. Joe Papp's operation down on Lafayette Street is one of our regional theaters. The Manhattan Theater Club is a regional theater. The Circle Repertory. Well, no, you take the Circle Repertory Company, which just a couple of years ago was riding high and getting grants all over the place, and everybody, including myself, was doing stories about it. And they had important and vigorous playwrights like Lanford Wilson and Marshall Mason, the artistic director there. And now Mason's about to leave, and that operation, you can feel it starting to unravel a bit. It wants to change. It wants to become something different. It doesn't know what that something different is. So you can even feel it in New York, I think.
I would like to quote from an article that is in Newsweek this week. It's actually the article immediately preceding Jack Kroll's review of the new Neil Simon play, which talks about, this is not how they describe it, but I would talk about it, the flight of the American playwright to the movies. And there is a quote from David Mamet that I would like to read and have Jack Kroll comment on. And David Mamet states, quote, "To me, the great American art form is the movies. It's the movies that really expresses our culture. That's what throws us all together as the theater might have at one time, but doesn't anymore." And as we all know, David Mamet has been a very successful American playwright and is now devoting most of his energies to movies. And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about that.
Oh, yeah. Funny, I was going to bring all this up. I'd forgotten what our format was going to be. By the way, format, I'm glad to see you here. But I did that interview with David Mamet.
Oh,
and
so this is the horse's mouth here at the microphone.
That's right, yeah. And he not only said that, he said much more along the same lines, which really I think tells you what's happening. He said, in addition to what you've read, movies form the last vestige of national culture. Last vestige of national culture. David said, we all know what Make My Day means or who E.T. is, you know. And I don't even think TV has that power. Once in a while, something captures a little bit of imagination like Hill Street. I think David said that because he's just written an episode for Hill Street.
I also think his wife is now in it.
Actually, Hill Street is good. He goes on to say, people remember Scarlett O'Hara forever. And then we started to talk about, I said to him, we talk about the great, still unrealized dream in this country of the repertory theater. A dream that crops up every 10 years or so and still hasn't really happened. And I said to him, to me, the real repertory companies in the United States have always been in the movies. Back in the 30s and 40s, in the heyday of the studio system, that's where you had real repertory companies. When you went to see a Warner Brothers movie with Jimmy Cagney and Joan Blondell and Frank McHugh and Humphrey Bogart and Sidney Greenstreet and Peter Lorre, that's a repertory company. They appeared in different combinations and permutations in movie after movie. And the same thing was true of Columbia with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn and so forth, and MGM with the great musicals and their great slew of character actors. Those were our repertory companies. The movies were the movies achieved that ideal where the theater was not and has not been able to do it. And when you find out that a David Mamet has been a movie freak from from the beginning. In fact, I said to him, I was really quite surprised by all of this. Not surprised so much, I was struck by it. And I said, well, David, if you have always felt this way about movies, how come you went into the theater? And he said, well, you find, you think, my God, breaking into the movies, how can I do that? It's such an unrealizable dream. Whereas all you need from theater is a pencil and a piece of paper, and 3 maniacal friends. And before you know it, you have a theater. But now you see that he has an ingress into the movies. He said, for example, talking about his last play, which I guess was a kind of success. It played for a very long time.
Glengarry Glen Ross.
Glen Ross didn't make any money, though. It's just like, this happens more times than we realize. Follies played almost 2 years, lost money. Steve Sondheim's show, Sunday in the Park with George, played a year, lost money. Glengarry Ross had a great-looking run, lost money. It hurt Mamet. He said, I think this is quoted in the story, he said, Broadway doesn't want a new play every year from me anymore. Okay, they're not going to get it. I've got to work. I'm going to go somewhere where I can work and where it turns out they appreciate me. He showed me some footage from his new film, the first film that he directed from his own script. And it's very interesting. You can see where he's tried to make some kind of synthesis of his well-known theatrical sensibility with movie form. One of the most amazing things that he said to me, to my amazement, we think of David Mamet as a dialogue, as a speech guy. He's invented a whole new kind of human speech. And yet what fascinates him about the movies is that he understands that dialogue is not the primary thing, that you have to learn to tell a story in pictures. Very few playwrights would even begin to admit that. It sort of, I think, horrifies them to even think that. But David embraces it, and he's looking forward to working in that kind of medium. Well, when a David Mamet is now turning away from the theater toward film, and this is true of, that's what that story was about.
The story mentions
Yeah.
8 other playwrights, Chris Durang, Wendy Wasserstein, Ted Talley. I mean, it mentions a whole series of playwrights.
This is very serious.
Well, I think you touched on something, though, which I think is very interesting, which is, I think, for many of these playwrights, the movies represent a national culture, and the theater has never been able to address sort of a national audience because it's such a large country. It has never had sort of a homogeneous culture that it can tap into. This was an issue that was brought up both by John Steinman and Stanley Kaufman in talking about the strength of the British playwrights, is that there is a common vocabulary among the British culture that can embrace the theater, which doesn't exist in America.
That's true. It's true. You go to London, where I'll be, thank goodness, next week, and that can be the center of the culture because the culture physically is so small and concentrated, and you're very aware of this. And so the chief creative people, whether they're writers or directors or performers, can move from theater to film to television. That's what really makes you sad, because the level of drama on television is so high. And there, you turn on your TV, and there are the same people you've just seen at the National Theater. There's Ian McKellen and Dorothy Tootin and everybody. And that's true, that the sheer vast size of the United States, with its it's not just the size, but it's a country of many different cultures. And you have the impossibility of centralizing it. And that a lot of people will say, well, that's a very good thing. That's what we hate about Broadway, because it pretends to be the cultural capital. New York pretends to be the cultural capital, and of course there can be no cultural capital. Why shouldn't Minneapolis or Houston or Chicago or Los Angeles or San Francisco or now San Diego be just as much of a cultural capital? And although that sounds good, it's not so much that one wants New York or any one particular locale to be the capital, but you want you've got a heart right here in your body, and it would not occur to anyone to say, well, why should I have a heart? Well, who does this heart think he is? Why shouldn't all that energy be distributed throughout the body? What the heart simply does is act as a kind of pumping station for the energy of the system.
Well,
of the
I also think it
organism.
incorporates sort of a series of goals. I mean, I do think that for all of the past vitality of the regional theater, it never even began to match the allure of Broadway. I mean, I think Broadway served as a very, very important capstone to one's efforts in the theater.
Yeah, it's very interesting and it's very tricky, and it has to do, among other things, with your original question about the regional theater. There's a kind of test case, I think, that almost goes to the heart of the matter. Some years ago, after the first regime at Lincoln Center here in New York, which was the high Broadway establishment, Elia Kazan and Robert Whitehead and Arthur Miller and all of those people, and they were the obvious people to run what was supposed to be the big national theatrical ensemble here, and it didn't work. They failed. And so what do we do now? Who do we bring in? And most of the theater critics, reasonably smart theater critics in the country, were called in by the board at Lincoln Center, and many of them said the same thing. They said, well, all of this just goes to prove that the Broadway establishment is worn out, that energy, that creative force has really eroded. We now have to go into the regions. That's where things are happening. And there are a couple of theaters. For example, there's the Actors Studio, or I think it was called that, in San Francisco, run by these two very strong people, Herbert Blau and Julius Erving. They're doing remarkable work. And why don't you think of bringing people like that in? Robert Brustein, who is then really our leading intellectual critic, if you want to use that kind of label, said this. We who were called in at Newsweek said this. Others said this. Lo and behold, the board at Lincoln Center brought in these people. And a very interesting thing happened. We who had said this started to go to those shows put on by those people, and we sat there saying, wait a second, this isn't so great. What happened here? Is this really the operation? Did some mysterious chemical change take place in the transference from San Francisco to New York? And Brustein had the guts really to confront it, to write about it. He wrote a very remarkable piece saying we were wrong and trying to pin down where it went wrong. It's a very difficult thing to talk about, but if you went out in most regional theater and watched what they were doing, you found yourself more often than not in a way that really upset you. It was very difficult to figure out. You found yourself making allowances. The standard was different. You didn't want it to be different. You to entertain the thought that it was different was almost unbearable, and yet in most cases it was.
I think the other advantage to having a center, wherever that center is, and I feel very fortunate to live in what I perceive to be the center, regardless of whether we're in a decline or not, is that you also have artists rubbing up against other artists. I mean, I am very struck by sort of my artistic director colleagues in the regional theater, the number of very important theater works and theater artists whose work they've never seen.
Yeah, and it's amazing how many people, like editors, for example, aren't even aware of everything that goes on in New York, not only in theater, but in dance and music and so forth. It's really astonishing. But the whole New York thing is so tricky. It has its drawbacks. I was thinking on my way here about, as we know, in the last year or two, Chicago has become a center of attention with groups like Steppenwolf and others that have suddenly gotten high national visibility. Steppenwolf is an operation that's been in, they've been alive for about 10 years, which seems to be the kind of... Anyway, suddenly they come to New York, they get national attention, and what is the result of all this? They're hailed, new style of acting, taking the play away from New York actors, new kind of theatrical energy, amazing, John Malkovich, Gary Sinise, and others. And because of the focus, because of these Eastern energies, Hollywood contracts are offered, the thing begins to fragment, the thing begins to break up. Here's Malkovich doing something over here, here's Gary Sinise doing something over here. Paramount rushes in with a 3-year movie contract. And you talk to them and you say, well, what's going to happen now that Steppenwolf has made it? Apparently it's the unmaking of Steppenwolf. And they say, oh no, we're going to try to keep it together. We're going to, yes, every other year or so we'll be able to come together. But you realize, now that's a paradox. You come to the center because you want to feed off that energy and you want that kind of success, and the result is that you start to disintegrate.
It is a paradox, a rather distressing one. I think most of us can get fairly discouraged and depressed about the state of American playwriting. I'd like to switch to the issue of American directors, which is a theme that's been running through this series. And some of our previous participants have expressed rather grave reservations about the work of directors such as Peter Sellers,
yeah.
Robert Wilson, Richard Foreman, et al., particularly their work with classics, not so much their work with their own pieces, but their work with their interpretations of classic work. And I was wondering what your opinion was both of these artists and their current influence on the mainstream American theater.
Yeah, well, I'm a great admirer of Peter Sellers, especially of the names that you mentioned. All three of them, actually, but for the moment, Sellers is the one that I'm most interested in. But you know, what they try to do at their best is not to screw up, quote, the classics. No, that's not what they're doing. You know, people don't realize Shakespeare, the classics, that's Shakespeare, right? And we act sometimes as if for the last 400 years, there's a kind of mainstream, Shakespeare was done the way Shakespeare ought to have been done. But if we could have sort of a time-lapse home movie of the way Shakespeare has been done for the last 400 years, we would see the most astonishing, the most amazing differences depending on the state of the culture at that particular moment.
At one point, didn't they all have happy endings? I think that there was that
whole period of Baudelarization when the texts as written by Shakespeare simply couldn't be presented because they were too scandalous and too risky and too dirty and too everything. So yes, they were Baudelarized, and King Lear had a happy ending, and Macbeth had a happy ending, and that was accepted by the culture. I mean, if you protested about that, you were some sort of Peter Sellers of your time, you see. Who is this jerk? What is he trying to do? But that's the case. There's never been the right way to do the classics. A couple of years ago, within the same week, I went up to the American Repertory Theatre in Cambridge. They were doing a production of Three Sisters, directed by Andrei Serban, the Romanian director, who also is one of these guys that's widely hated by your friends that you mentioned. And a couple of days later, I came down to New York to see the Three Sisters done at the Manhattan Theatre Club in a very straightforward, conventional fashion. Nothing wrong with that, that's the way the Moscow Art Theater did it for many years, But the difference was amazing because the real Chekhov was up in Cambridge, where Andrei Serban had been discombobulating the play only to recombobulate it. And there was more Chekhov, there was more of that passion and more of that emotion and more of that everything there than in the superficially classical, traditional, straightforward production here in New York. And so I wrote a kind of double review pointing out this paradox. So you see, and it didn't have to be that.
I'm sure your editors loved that review. They probably didn't know who Chekhov was.
Well, but you see, it doesn't have to be that way. Not that the so-called avant-garde director is always right. Most of them are just as untalented or charlatanish as most people in this country, the 8 trillion people working in the arts are, you see. So that's not, I remember seeing a production of Henry V, actually by a very well-known director, I guess I shouldn't mention his name, coming hard on the heels of the productions by Peter Brook that came here to Broadway. You remember Midsummer Night's Dream, which was a revolutionary production, and it just set all the American directors on fire, and they all wanted to do something like this. And so here came this guy, as I say, a very well-known and highly thought-of director, not a young guy at all, And out came the soldiers dribbling basketballs, and so forth. Nothing wrong with that. I love basketball, but this was. There was no reason for it. He hadn't thought things through. This was not an inspiration that opened up the play in a new way, you see. It was just a gimmick. So you have to have, well, I have to say it, you have to have the intelligence and the taste, and you have to care about it. You have to lean forward and try to see what is actually going on. Is this play actually being opened up for us by a Peter Sellers, by a Robert Wilson, by a Richard Foreman? If you simply know that it's Richard Foreman, and you know that he works in a certain way, that he hangs clotheslines across the stage, and that he gooses you orally with a buzzer every 11 minutes or so, if you just know that, and you just sit there knowing that, and not being able to see what he's actually doing to the play in front of you, then you're not going to be able to see if he succeeds or if he fails. And that goes even more for Peter Sellers. A couple of seasons ago out in Minneapolis, Sellers did a production called Gorky and Gershwin. What he did was take the score of a Gershwin show and hook it up with a play by Maxim Gorky. And, so on the surface you say, oh, but it was beautiful and it was delightful. And one of the things that made him do it was the fact that he realized that Gorky and Gershwin were both Russians. One, immigrant family that came to this country, but still with roots there, and Gorky was Gorky. Wouldn't it be interesting to try to explore some sort of common ground that perhaps these two artists might have culturally, one in his plays and the other in his music? And he tried to do that. Not a total success, just like a Neil Simon play, but something very lovely and very fascinating and very moving was happening there. And if you just are open enough and have the taste, really, these things are a matter of taste. Taste is a whole subject for another discussion. Then you're not foreclosed. What happens, I think, to a lot of these critics is that they never get around to seeing what's up there in front of their noses because, as I've just said, all they can think of, oh yeah, Peter Sellers, he's the guy who took Mozart's Così fan tutte and put it in a diner, a contemporary diner. That can't be good. Interestingly enough, this past summer, went up to Summerfest, Summer Fair, to see Peter's production of Così fan tutte, which takes place in a diner. And sitting next to me was this middle-aged couple. They opened their programs, and they looked at Peter Sellers' notorious program notes, And the wife said to the husband, oh, no, did you know this? Did you know this is not? Oh, this is awful. He puts it in a hamburger joint? Oh, let's get out of here. This is terrible. And the husband said, well, just honey, let's give it a chance now. Let's wait a second, The music will be there. Relax. Take it easy. Well, at the end of that show, the wife, I think, loved the production more than the husband did. Mm-hmm. Because totally open, not a critic, wasn't writing for New York Magazine or Newsweek for that matter, and the thing came through, and it was very strong and very powerful.
Related to that, could you speak to the issue, which I think this happened last year in Cambridge, where Samuel Beckett wanted to close Joanne Akalaitis' production of Endgame because it's similar to Così in that she set it in a subway station was the setting, and he thought this so distorted the intention of the play that I don't know if he actually was able to have it closed, but he certainly wanted to have it closed. No. And to what degree is the director responsible for executing the playwright's intention or vision of the play?
The director is responsible for not betraying the spirit of the play. And that is how you are faithful to the spirit of the play and still change an 18th century court scene or whatever to a diner, or change Beckett's original limbo setting to a subway. That is a very, very complicated thing. What happened in this particular case, I know something about. Samuel Beckett never got to see that production. He got his information about it from his intermediaries. And it wasn't exactly a matter of artistic faithfulness or ethics, because at the very same time there was another production of Endgame, which was traveling through making a national tour, and that had kind of the imprimatur of Grove Press and Bonnie Rossett, who's Beckett's publisher and so forth. So there's a little more to it than Beckett was getting his information from people who were telling him, for example, that Joanne Akalaitis had changed his play to a musical because there was music by Philip Glass. Nothing could be farther from the truth. It wasn't a musical at all. Philip Glass wrote some musical at certain interludes in the play, which was extremely strong and which helped the play. There was very little of it. Mr. Beckett was getting screwed up information from people who wanted to get him all hot and bothered and wanted him to close down this production of his play for their own not so lofty reasons. And so he reacted in this fashion because he trusted his friends to tell him the truth. They were not really telling him the truth. But aside from that, there had been productions in Europe, for example, of Endgame, supposedly with Beckett's approval, or certainly without his disapproval, by major theaters in France and Belgium. I remember one of them took place, for example, partially underwater, not a peep out of Beckett. No, this production was so faithful to Endgame that it made your head spin. If you think about it for a moment, what could be a more simple and logical, gentle extension of Beckett's sense of place than a beat-up, crummy, ratty, scabby, peeling New York subway station? If we're looking for the end of the world in this culture, and I'll tell you, I had seen one of the most amazing productions of a Beckett play some years before, done by avant-garde group in this city, Mabou Mines. This was done with tiny little stick figures. And so the audience was a very tiny audience because you were all crowded around looking down at these tiny little figures that were being manipulated with music by Philip Glass and the voice of a marvelous actor with a great voice, David Warlow, Mm-hmm. This was one of the most brilliant Beckett productions I had ever seen. No peep out of Sam Beckett. You see? So one has to be very careful. What happened, they tried very hard to close the show, and finally a compromise was reached. Because I happened to be up there at the time, and there were lawyers on both sides. On into the wee hours of the morning, these calls were going back and forth. It reminded me very much of Giuliani versus Puccio, artistic subdivision. And threats were made, I will take it, back and forth and back and forth. And finally, they said, well, okay, if you will put in your program a note stipulating that this production is without the approval of the author, that will satisfy us. And so the American Repertory Theater was happy to do that, and that was. But actually, there was a big artistic issue there. But you see,
Well, it also happened with Anne Bogart's production of South Pacific, where the Rodgers and Hammerstein estate also tried to close it down. I mean, there were a series of examples of.
What was their beef?
Again, the original spirit of South Pacific was in no way preserved.
I'm trying to figure out how you can screw up the original spirit of South Pacific.
Well, she did it in a very deconstructed manner.
Maybe thinking. 7th evening. You may be. I don't quite get it, Well, no. You see, it takes taste. Taste is something that you don't hear very much about today. It's a very nebulous. Everybody thinks he has great taste, and the next guy has jerky taste. That's what John Simon thinks. And that's what we think about John. So it's a Mexican standoff there. No, John is Mexican, isn't he? No, whatever. Everybody picks on John, so I don't mean to. It's a cheap laugh.
Well, that's because he picks on everybody.
Well, that's true. He does pick on everybody. But you wish he is such a smart cookie that you wish he would relax take it easy, John. Take a deep breath, Forget that it's Peter Sellers. Come on, didn't you ever have the dream of doing something in a new way that would unlock meanings that have been barnacled by constant and conventional, use again and again and again and again and again? We've got to get into these things. I mean, how many times can you do to be or not to be? You've got to find a way to break it open, not to foul it up, but to break it open so that it will have the revelatory power that it had when Shakespeare first wrote it. And the best artists are constantly thinking of ways to do that. And you must be open to that possibility.
I also think that many of these productions certainly attract a younger audience.
That's true.
And they seem to utilize particularly a visual vocabulary that younger people seem to be more comfortable with.
Yeah, that's true of Robert Wilson, I suppose. That's true. And, there is a kind of, it started in the 60s, I guess, when young people brought a totally different idea to the arts into the culture. And there was an amazing and instant face-off between the generations. In theater, for example, the avant-garde theater of that time, the living theater and the open theater and other operations like that, tried to break down. I mean, those people make Peter Sellers look like an absolute classicist. Peter, in fact, in my view, is a classicist. He is a disguised traditionalist. He really is. I don't think of him as a guy who tears things apart at all. I would point to Foreman, perhaps, as someone who does that. But the living theater and the open theater and organizations like that tried to do many things. They tried to crack the conventionality of the theater, which they thought was ossifying the theater. They tried to break down that gap which they thought had become a dead space between the audience and the theater. And they achieved some things, and a lot of other things they were perhaps mistaken in. But you can't legislate the culture. It happens. Energy is simply going to manifest itself. You react to it the way you want to react to it. It leaves behind whatever gains it may have made. The losses go seeping back into the drains, and we move on. But unless you're really open to really what's going on, the simplest way to put it is you're missing all the fun. And you have to have the taste and the intelligence to be able to tell the good from the bad. All the learning, all the academic background in the world is not going to do it for you. Yes, you have to have some of that. You have to know what's going on. You have to know that Chekhov isn't Neil Simon. But I say that because he wrote that play some years ago called The Good Doctor, which was about Chekhov. Doc Simon and Dr. Chekhov is what the parallel he was aiming. But you have to have the taste, you have to have the smarts, and most of all, you have to have not just the willingness, but you have to be eager to do it, not just grudgingly willing to do it, because that's what your job is. That's why you're here. As long ago as Goethe, of all people, he said something to the effect that if I'm not alive to exactly what's going on in my time, in this moment in the world, then I'm dead, and that's true. And my objection to I mean, it's fun to argue about this stuff with a guy like John Simon. He thinks A, you think B. That's perfectly okay. But what these guys do is totally dismiss the whole impulse. You see, this impulse, they say, is bad because there is something called the classics, and we know what they are, and they are eternally there. They're locked up in some platonic safe deposit box, and we mustn't disturb those little gold bars in there. That's basically their attitude. And it's the attitude, for example, of John to language. Anyone who's read his essays on language, how he laughs at so-called black English and Hispanic English. It's amazing that a man of his intelligence seems unaware how his own language, the English language, if that is his own language, how it's grown over the millennia. And it's still growing because of what now, I remember, we shouldn't attack poor John, but since you did bring him up, it's your fault.
No, I said previous participants. I mentioned no one by name.
I saw through your. He said
he was not alone in his criticism.
Oh, I know that, and I don't mean I single him out really only because he's the smartest one of the bunch. That's and as I say, it's fun to argue about stuff like this with. I wish you were here right now. At this point, I should go into my John Simon imitation, but those of you who were here the last 2 years have probably seen enough of that. But just to finish him off, he said one thing in an essay a couple of years ago in talking about what obviously to pun upon the whole thing is a bête noire of his, English as spoken by black people. And he said, just imagine the works of Wittgenstein written in black English, you know. Well, why imagine that? What an asinine thing to ask us to imagine. Wittgenstein wouldn't write in black English. But I'll tell you one thing, he'd be damned interested in it. And if he were alive today, he'd be dealing with it. And he would be writing about it, and it would have been factored into his operation as a thinker about language and as a philosopher, you see. So you must be open, you must be interested. You know, let's face it, what's the real impulse? What's the real impulse behind this kind of reactionary refusal, even to entertain these possibilities? That's what I'm talking about. It's fear. It's fear. These smart guys are afraid. They're afraid because they sense that somewhere out there in the world there are new energies, very dangerous energies, very chancy energies. We don't know where these energies are going to take us, but they're out there, and maybe they're a little undirected and they're clumsy and they rattle around and they're ramshackle and they disturb us and they interfere with the normal way of doing things, and they're changing things, and it's pretty scary. It's fear that drives the academic mind to this kind of behavior, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the academic mind, which may have its virtues. It does have its virtues. I once was an academic myself, in my virtuous part of life. But, well, I've said enough on the subject. No, Peter Sellers especially, I think, is a remarkable young American artist who really is still, as much work as he's done, and he's done a hell of a lot of work, he's still only at the beginning of a career. Now, you know, he's just suffered a body blow. He went down to form something. Wasn't his idea to call it the American National Theater in Washington, D.C. That was Roger Stevens' idea. He told me about this in Minneapolis before he took the job. He said, it's an offer I can't refuse. I said, I give you a year in Washington. At the end of a year, the Congress of the United States is going to pass a special resolution kicking your crazy ass out of the nation's capital. You know?
He and Poindexter and Admiral North.
Well, I mean, it happened. They gave him a year and a half or 2 seasons, and they did kick his crazy ass out of Washington. That's okay. That was a good experience for him. He did some things there that are going to be built on within his own work. He's constantly thinking and rethinking. He is so smart. I mean, you should get him here at some point, really. I just love to sit here and talk with Peter, because he knows far better than these academics do. If he does a Chekhov play, he knows the essence of that Chekhov play, the details, the texture, the structure, where it comes from, where it's going, and then he does his little redialing of it. And if it works, you are moved and touched and astonished by it in a way that you've never been before, and it's the 17th time you've seen this play. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the greatest production of the play you've ever seen, but it's a production for our time, because this is a crazy time. I was going to read another quote from David Mount where he says that we're living in a time where things are breaking up, and we must create new ways of doing our culture, and that's why he's going into the movies, because he feels the movies are way ahead of the theater.
I'd like to touch on that and the new energies that you were talking about, because it seems to me that some of the new energies are sort of directed away from presentation of sort of the prototypical or the stereotypical play, and they seem to be drifting more towards presentation either of a performance or of a series of visual images. I'm thinking of Eric Bogosian, Laurie Anderson, even Martha Clark with Vienna Lusthouse. I mean, there seems to be a movement towards theatrical experiences that are not grounded in a play, per se. And I would like to hear your observations.
Well, that's maybe the most important thing that's happening in theater. That's really the cutting edge of the theater at the moment, I think. That's where a new synthesis of elements is being made, a new combination. We'll take dance, we'll take music, we'll take the actor, we'll take a script, and we'll put it together in a new form. It won't be, as you say, a play in the sense that we've come to know a play. Now again, you've got to have your wits about you. You've got to have your brains and your taste. And you can't be afraid either way. You can't sit there and say, oh my God, this is over my head, but I guess it must be terrific because I read it in the Village Voice, so, but I don't like it. It's a very difficult thing to pin down. Now you mentioned, and these things are only one man's opinion. Everything is only one man's opinion. You mentioned Bogosian. Okay. I saw his show, his one-man show. I found it disappointing because I felt to a certain extent he was exploiting some of the material.
Jack, do you want to describe it for people who perhaps did not see it?
Oh, sure. He does, for example, this is a one-man show, and Bogosian is an excellent actor. He's a first-rate actor, a very attractive young guy in his early 30s, who plays various characters of our time in the American culture, who play a very high-pressure Hollywood agent, for example, making a deal on the telephone, with that staccato, kinetic, crazy, neurotic, nervous wreck delivery. Part chiseler, part maniac, part coke fiend, It's a character that we've seen in many movies and on television. Lots of comedians have done it. In fact, part of his operation is that of a kind of stand-up comic. Some of it reminds you a little of Lenny Bruce.
And it communicates a very dark picture of America.
Well, yes and no. You see, that's one of the things I found very, very equivocal about the final impact of his work, that you think he's taking you into a dark vision. And suddenly, now again, this is just me talking, suddenly you realize that actually it's not so dark, and that he wants finally to ingratiate. And so the edge is taken off. Now, I found the same thing, for example, true to a certain extent of Whoopi Goldberg in her show.
And much more, and Lily Tomlin is another person.
Well, now we're getting into tricky areas because I like her work enormously. You see, she doesn't pretend to take you into a dark place. One look at Lily Tomlin and you know what she's all about. She's about reconciliation and about embracing and about love, really. That may be sentimental, but I think when she's at her best, she is not sentimental. She is all about positive energy that embraces and accepts. Bogosian is saying to you, look at this guy. Oh boy, what a weasel. Then he takes you into the street and he becomes a black drunkard or a druggie, And then I began to get a little uneasy because we've seen Richard Pryor do this. This is from the horse's mouth. When Pryor does it, it's the real thing. He makes you laugh and you can feel your laughter cutting into yourself while you're laughing. And you don't want to think, well, now wait a minute, this white guy shouldn't be doing this because he doesn't really know about it. No, if he had the inside, if he had Pryor does white folks as well, and quite brilliantly. But I felt, you see, that he was emotionally panhandling at certain points in his performance. He would come to the edge of the stage, for example, and he would be this black wino or this black junkie. And instead of horrifying you and scaring you and maybe even jarring a few political bones in your body, suddenly you realize that what he's really thinking of, and again, I keep saying this was just the way it struck me. Most people thought it was quite wonderful. You feel that he's trying to ingratiate himself. He's trying to exploit material that he hasn't really swallowed, that he hasn't felt the pain of it. He hasn't been there. To be a real artist, to use human material is a tremendous moral responsibility. You can go out there and do an impression, a takeoff on everybody from Jimmy Cagney to Ronald Reagan. Fine, if it's just going to be that, if you're going to be Rich Little or whatever. But if you go out there saying to us, I'm going to show you something that you haven't noticed. I'm going to make you feel something so far down in your heart and your soul that it's really going to break you up. And then it turns out that, well, it's not really that. He hasn't gone that far down, you see. So I felt something of that with Bogosian, while admitting his tremendous talent as an actor. He's very young. Now, who else did you mention? You mentioned Laurie Anderson. Okay, that's a different thing entirely. She is so many things that your mind boggles. She's a dramatist, she's a director, she's a musician, many different kinds of musician. She's a filmmaker, she's a satirist, and she puts together a kind of epic collage of elements that is really astonishingly brilliant. Now, not all of that works either, but her canvas is so vast, and I think, her aim is very similar to that, say, of David Byrne today. For those of you who may have seen the movie True Stories, which is on right now. Now, this is an interesting thing. True Stories is such an interesting film. One of the things that it made me think was that there's nothing I've seen in the theater in the last couple of years that has this kind of originality, reaching out to show you something about the country as it is today, and what the implications of certain kind of things going on in the culture may be. See, now again, you're talking about taste and so forth. Most of the critics who liked True Stories liked it because they said, well, here's this guy, David Byrne, who comes from the avant-garde of rock, the Talking Heads, and now we can see this little change in him. He's reaching out, he's embracing the American heartland, he's embracing the people in the heartland. He decided to sort of junk his pose of being the avant-garde. He's now one of us. He loves us. That's not what that movie is about at all. It's, if anything, the exact opposite. This is a movie about, to quote myself, the smiling facade, I'm misquoting myself, that hides the American panic at the present moment. Those who think that David Byrne is in love with the American heartland haven't gotten the message. Well, Laurie Anderson does something like that. She's a much more ambitious, maybe some people think too ambitious, artist than Bogosian is. Martha Clark is a fascinating artist whose work I happen to like enormously. The primary impulse there, of course, is the dance impulse. And you mentioned Vienna Lusthaus, I think, and the work that she did before that, Garden of Earthly Delights, two really amazing works that have to do technically with cultures in the historic past, but really that have everything to do with culture now and culture every time and every place.
And do you think that all of these artists and many of these pieces are really trying to come to terms with that which is uniquely theatrical as opposed to that which looks like bad television on the stage now?
That's right.
I mean, there seems to be a movement away from strict realism.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Now that's not well. That's another thing that you know, it's fashionable to put down realism. You have to be very careful of that because, for example, I must mention, I think this is tremendously important. At the same time that Robert Wilson's work was being presented up at Cambridge, the American Repertory Theater, and then down in New York, at the exact moment, you had this remarkable festival of new South African plays at Lincoln Center. Now, one of the most stupid pieces I've ever read in the New York Times, the Sunday piece, just about the end of that festival of South African plays.
Let's not name names.
No, I should say it wasn't Frank Rich.
Right.
No, or it wasn't Mel Gusso. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Go on.
You mean he's here tonight? You mean you've had him on this stage? Well, whoever it was said he didn't like these plays. Fine. Perfectly okay. He said that a play should teach you something about either art or life, perhaps both, if you're lucky. True. These plays taught you nothing about either art or life. Now, you know, you went to those plays, and they come from another culture, and a culture at a totally different stage of development from ours, or indeed from any other culture in the world.
And there was so much life.
Those plays don't teach you anything about life? Sure, I thought they don't teach you anything about life on West End Avenue. And that's what this guy was talking about. But to say, how can you sit there? Now, these plays were grounded in a certain kind of realism. Now, realism is supposed to be out of fashion. So what are you supposed to do? You're going to tell the young black South African playwrights who are trying to put their experience on the stages of the world and what that experience means. And you're going to tell them, hey, haven't you guys heard? Realism is dead, baby. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense. And the fact of the matter is that we don't take it in as realism because it's not our reality. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And here's a guy in the most important newspaper in the world saying that he learned nothing about either art or life from the South African play. No wonder they feel about us and about whites and about white culture the way they do. Now, there were 4 or 5 or 6 plays. Each of them was very different. The sensibility of the playwright was very different. They were so important. They put you in touch with the roots of the theater, which we tend to forget about. That the theater comes out of the most primal kind of experience. And if it doesn't come out of that, it doesn't come out of anything. At the same time, you had just come from seeing Robert Wilson, who has long gone past this kind of thing. The interesting thing for me was the relationship between these two forms of theater. There was a real relationship. They seemed like two kinds of making art couldn't be more different, and on the surface that's true. But the important thing was to see where the contact was made. Because if Wilson's art is about the same kind of primal experience, and at its best it is, then it had to have some contact. Now I want very badly to write a story about all this and to do a kind of double piece on both of them, you see. And 5 or so years ago I would have been able to do that. Unfortunately, this was a double whammy, because bad enough to want to write about Wilson, but to write about Wilson and South African playwrights in the same piece, that's really asking too much, isn't it? You know? Although I did manage to do two separate pieces on them. But you see, why am I telling this story? Oh yeah, the business of realism, you see.
Realism and new forms.
Yeah, realism and new forms. You know, there's a way of looking at art that says that if the art is good, it's all realism, if you know what I mean. Picasso is realism. Mondrian is realism, because it's simply a different form of reality. If it's a revelation and a vision, and you feel it changing your kishkas in some fashion, then that's realism. We think realism is a guy walking into a room and saying, "Hi, Max," "Hi, Mo," and that could be the most unreal or the most surreal thing in the world, right? If it's done by Weber and Fields or the Three Stooges or the Ritz Brothers or the Marx Brothers, you know. Those guys weren't realists either. But you could say that all art, if it's good, is realism in the sense that it creates a reality for you to experience, you know. Just as you could say that all music, no matter how it may sound to you at first, is melody. If it works, if you see what I mean. You know. Where are we?
We're about to start audience questions here. Many plays survive despite the critics. Who's wrong? And this is a 2-part question. Part 2 is there a herd instinct among critics?
Yes, among every other critic except me, there is a tremendous herd. You notice I'm all alone up here. There's nobody. The herd is out there somewhere, you know. No, among some critics, there's a herd instinct. You know, the poor critic, let's say at newspaper X, they need a critic, a drama critic, a movie critic, or whatever. And depending on what their idea of the arts is, you know, the critic is hired by a real live, or so it seems, human being. And he has a certain idea of what he needs. He may hire a poor son of a gun who has no more reason to be a critic. It's not his fault. And suddenly he starts writing about this. I'll never forget, for example, at Lincoln Center one night, at a first night, and it was The Playboy of the Western World by John Millington Synge. Is that one of the most famous plays ever written? Yes, it is. And I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I looked up, And sitting behind me was a very well-known critic from one of our New York newspapers, and he leaned forward and he said to me, "Oh, excuse me, Jack, how do you pronounce the name of the gentleman who wrote this play?" So, just because a guy is a critic doesn't mean he's a critic, if you know what I mean. Yes, many of them have a herd instinct because they are under pressure from editors. They really are under tremendous pressure from editors. They are under pressure from the world that they deal with, Many of them want so desperately to get along, if they're drama critics, with playwrights and producers and everybody and so forth. And I'm not even saying that in a disparaging fashion. So, the paradox is the herd instinct goes along at precisely the same time with an antipathy toward the individual members of the herd. Most critics don't like each other very much, and yet they band together for warmth, If you attend a meeting of the New York Drama Critics Circle, it can be a very funny theater of the observed. And Wilfred Sheed wrote a novel about drama critics some years ago called Max Jameson. Max Jameson is a critic based on someone whose name we might even have mentioned here tonight. And in writing about these guys and this odd combination of the herd instinct and the antipathy, I feel sorry for critics, I really do, because they have a very tough job. And it's a tough job under the best of circumstances, and what we have now are not the best of circumstances. But now, anybody who pays the wrong kind of attention to any critic is really pathetic. A good critic should make you think for yourself, and you should like the critic the more you disagree with him. As paradoxical as that may sound, because it's not the opinion that counts. You have to respect the intelligence, and it's fun to enter in a kind of mystical dialogue with a guy that probably you're never going to meet. But he's not there so that his opinion should be taken as gospel. Oh, yeah, well, Frank Rich or Jack Kroll or John Simon says this, therefore. It's what these people are trying to do is start a two-way conversation with you. They want you to think for yourself, believe it or not, or when they're functioning at their best, they do. Now, of course, in order to think for yourself, you're going to have to shell out $50 these days. That's the tricky part of it, you see.
Currently on Broadway, there are more British successes in musicals, while American musicals are falling behind. The person here cites Rags, Raggedy Ann, Honky Tonk Nights, Smile. Why the Broadway musical is an American underlined art form.
Yeah, I'm doing a big story about this very thing right now. I'm interviewing all these people. That's right. At the present moment, we don't know how long this moment will last, the English of all people who couldn't get out of their own way on the musical stage, people who couldn't dance, who couldn't sing, who couldn't be delightful, English people, what that means, English people, my goodness. I used to go to London every year, and I'd see the big musical. I remember a couple of years ago I saw a musical called Mardi Gras, which was touted, at last the English have produced a musical that can be compared with the American musicals. It was so god-awful. I was thinking if Bob Fosse were sitting next to me, he'd be on the floor puking up his guts at this moment. Suddenly, these bumbling nincompoops have figured out how to do it better than we, New York Jews. They've taken it away from us. They have. They really have. And this is really fascinating. Now Les Miserables is about to open, right? It's going to be such a hit. Mm-hmm. and I've seen it in London, and although I had reservations about it, it deserves to be a hit because it has incredible energy, like American musicals used to have. You go to see Smile, there's something here and there's something there. A stage full of 20-year-old girls can't be all bad, right? So there it is. But yes, temporarily, we've forgotten how to do it. I was in Hal Prince's office earlier today, talking to him about exactly this thing. For 5.5 years, this man, the best director of musicals that we have in our time, maybe of all time, who knows, For 5 years, this poor guy had flop after flop after flop after flop. Hal Prince, right? He goes to London. He goes screaming to London, "Get me out of here," says Hal Prince. He has got a tremendous hit, Phantom of the Opera.
Now, one of the reasons that have been advanced as to why the British are doing so well with musicals is that they have been using popular artists, songwriters in particular, which has not happened by and large in this country, except for Drood, actually, which I used Rupert
Holmes.
Yeah.
No.
And that in the past, the musicals did, I mean, in the past, the people who wrote for the musicals were also very popular, the equivalent of popular pop stars.
Yeah, well, I would put it in a somewhat different fashion. When you had a tremendous consensus of musical taste in this country, so that Gershwin and Irving Berlin and Cole Porter and Frank Lesser wrote music that went directly and instantly to the nerves and the heart of most Americans. This consensus of mainstream musical taste produced the music in our great musicals. Now that consensus has broken down, and you have a youth music, and you have a little older, and there is no central consensus. I know what you mean, but I don't know. Andrew Lloyd Webber he's a pop composer only in a certain way. You see, he's figured out how to do it. He's a classically trained composer. He can write really almost any kind of music there is. It's a very mysterious phenomenon. If you think about it, Andrew Lloyd Webber hasn't produced that many. Do we really go around humming the tunes of Andrew Lloyd Webber? To a degree we do. He's written, yes, Jesus Christ Superstar, someone said. Exactly, that's it, right. Now, interestingly enough, the two French guys who wrote the music and lyrics for Les Miserables were inspired by Jesus Christ Superstar. You see, there is no musical theater in this sense in France. Never has been. You have opera, you have other things, but you don't have the musical. These two guys went one night to see Andrew Lloyd Webber's Jesus Christ Superstar, and it set them on fire. They walked the streets for the rest of the night saying, "We have got to do this. We have got to bring this kind of thing into our culture." And that was the genesis of Les Miserables. But it's very mysterious. Duke Ellington may be our greatest composer in some fashion, certainly our greatest jazz composer. One of his great unrealized dreams was to have a successful Broadway musical. Everybody wants to have a Broadway. Ronald Reagan wants a Broadway musical. Poindexter wants a Broadway musical. And Ellington...
Especially now.
Oh, especially now.
Little does he know it's going to be about him.
But you see, just like Peter Sellers didn't make it in Washington, and neither is Reagan. Where was I? Yeah.
Duke Ellington. You're talking about Duke Ellington.
Pardon?
Duke Ellington won.
Yeah, Duke Ellington tried and tried and tried again. Never did it. Why? Because Duke Ellington was a pure jazz musician. You cannot write for very interesting and somewhat mysterious cultural and psychological reasons. You cannot write. Now, jazz is our greatest indigenous music. Our native jazz musicians are perhaps as a group the greatest artists that this country has produced. Really. Some people think it's silly, but Louis Armstrong is really as great a musician as Stravinsky in this century. And Charlie Parker and Charlie Christian, there were so many of them. These are our great musical artists. You cannot, for some mysterious reason, write a pure jazz score that makes an effective musical. But that's where the genius of a Gershwin comes in. A Gershwin can take jazz and transmute it, theatricalize it into something that works as theater and has some relationship to jazz. And one of the things that he has to suffer because of that is that a lot of black musicians and a lot of black culturati really, this upsets them tremendously, and they say George Gershwin is ripping off our jazz music. That's not true. Actually, what he's doing is taking this music and making a viable theatrical culture out of it. So somehow Andrew Lloyd Webber at the moment has found, but you see, I don't think that's the total. You have to look at these shows. I think just as important and perhaps more important than his contribution is the sense of vitality, the sense of spectacle, the sense of living and epic energy that they're starting really with a non-musical show, Nicholas Nickleby, which almost by now I sort of think of as a musical. That was the first show.
It does seem to me it has to translate into expense at some point. I mean, that musicals have gotten to be so expensive. I mean, to produce a Nicholas Nickleby or any of these musicals here would have been...
Here. Well, yeah, that's what Hal Prince was telling me
Yeah.
today, as a matter of fact. You see, he said, I asked him how much it cost to do Phantom of the Opera over there, and he said something like $2.5 million. Here it would have cost $5-6 million. You see, so right away you're in a hole. The English can do it much more cheaply. And now Hal's next show he's working on a show in Baltimore at the Center Stage. He really has such a horror of New York because of all the impossible. He points out, for example, it used to be when he was doing his hit shows, and not so much hit shows, although they were hit shows, as good shows. You know, he had people. He didn't have to worry about getting the money because the shows were so much more cheap to do. He had people who didn't worry about what he was doing, who were only too happy to give him the money. They weren't even worried about losing it. You know, they were delighted with the whole operation. Now, when musicals, like everything else, is run by very thin-lipped, cold-blooded business people, you know, who, yes, they're willing to spend $5 or $6 million, but boy, you're responsible to them, and they have got to know everything that you're doing, and why are you doing it, and who do you think is going to be interested in it? And a guy like Hal Prince...
Sounds like your editors.
Well, yeah, I think they're the same guys, as a matter of fact, you know, the richer version of them. The whole culture is interlocked in that sense, you see. Look, this is the age of Ronald Reagan. This is supposed to be the age of the entrepreneur. We're ruled by the bottom line. Our heroes are business people. Yeah, so now look, right? With 2 years to go, he didn't make it, did he? He didn't make it. There's Ivan Boesky, right? There are all these guys. He should have gotten out after the first term, you see? But he didn't, he wasn't able to shove it down the throat of this culture, making heroes out of those people who are only, they're speculators. David Mamet said this to me. I said to him, how are you getting along with
I think we're getting off on a tangent, but that's okay.
Well, that's okay. Tangent is interesting. At least I'm interested in it, right? So, I said to David Mamet, how do you get along with these Hollywood big shots? You know, you're this New York or in Chicago, you know. He says, I get along great with the working people, but the non-working people I don't get along with. I said, well, who do you mean by non-working people? You mean producers? He said, I mean anybody who's just in it to speculate and who doesn't do the work. In the age of Reagan, the speculator was supposed to be the hero, right? You too can speculate your way to glory. So now look. And let me tell you that it's a very serious situation. And if I say that I think that this kind of situation deeply affects the state of the culture and is actually one of the reasons why the arts break down, why theater breaks down, really, because you arouse certain expectations in audiences, you vulgarize the sensibility of audiences, you vulgarize the sensibility of your artists, of your creators, of your artistic entrepreneurs, all across the board, Broadway, New York, regional theater. There's a tremendous debt building up, and after those guys are thrown out 2 years from now, there's going to be a lot of cleaning up that really has to be done throughout the culture, I think. You know, behind the mask of... And ladies and gentlemen, I say to you that when I am elected...
My brother will vote for you. What playwrights now writing in America do you think are producing works of true and lasting artistic value?
Good question. I think David
Who do you
Mamet
like?
is.
That's the question.
Who do I like? I think David Mamet is. You know, you look at a play like American Buffalo, and you realize, at least I do, this play is going to be around like forever. They're going to be doing this play 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, because it says something about the country. You know, David Rabe is another one. Again, all the names I'm going to mention have their detractors, needless to say. I thought Hurly Burly was a very important play. It was a play about shallow, wise guys in Hollywood. So you would think, well, who cares about shallow, wise guys in Hollywood? And then you realize, no, it's about Americans. You know, all of us shallow, wise guys, including myself. You know, he's a very important writer. We have interesting women writers now. They're coming along very strongly. let's see, who else really blows my mind? Not that many. I would say Mamet and Ray. Sam Shepard has been around, for a guy who's still only 18 years old, he's been around forever. And he remains maybe the most interesting of all of them. Why? Because he's a heart on fire. And I think he's reached a kind of crossroads in his career right now. I think he's beginning to feel the seduction of wanting a large audience and willing in a very subtle way perhaps to compromise. And I think that we'll see what that's going to lead him to. But he's an extremely powerful and important writer, yeah. He's crazy and he's funny and he's American and he's brilliant. He notices things and he puts 10,000 things in each play, which sometimes confuses some people, you see. And he demands a certain kind of energy from actors and directors, which is part of the marvelous thing about theater. Yeah. That there's no way to act Shepard in a kind of conventional or traditional way. You must go a little nuts in order to do it. And that immediately, if things are under proper control, hooks you into certain energies that are very important. So these, among others, I would say.
Can the critic ever become an advocate? In particular, this person is noting that Robert Wilson's knee plays, which was given coverage in Newsweek, only had 4 New York performances. Can the critic ever create a climate where the artist is received in a more extended way?
Oh yeah. Now this is something that makes me sad. 20 or so years ago, I was writing pieces about Robert Wilson and Richard Foreman, and I will say that those pieces did help to create a climate. And there were people who were working with me on the magazine in other fields, in music and dance and visual arts. There's no question that we helped to create a climate. Absolutely no question in my mind. That is one of the most important functions of cultural journalism, maybe the most important function, you see. But now, when people are only thinking of, when they're counting heads, a movie is seen by 50 million people, but Jack, how many people only 1,000 people are in the theater every night, so they don't understand that the thing permeates throughout the culture and affects everything on every level. So absolutely, you can help to create a climate, no question about it. It's very important to write about these things and to write about them in the right way, to try to show how they are part of your life, whether you know it or not. That's the trick. That's the trick in cultural journalism, to show that these things are part of everyone's life in some fashion.
As a cultural reporter, do you feel that current plays, particularly American plays, are reflecting a more sordid view of life than in the past?
Of course, because life is more sordid than it has been in the past. Life is pretty sordid these days, in case we haven't noticed. Yeah, in a sense, that's true. The simplest way of looking at it, I can remember years ago, I forget which Elizabeth Taylor movie this was, but she said the word, I think, crap. And everyone in the audience really jumped out of their seats. I mean, crap gets you a PG-13 now, or if that, this is I dare not even say it on this stage. But no, this is a tremendously liberating thing, I think, because we have to have our noses rubbed in it. We don't have to worry about it. Art, it's up there. It's not going to attack us. We have to know about these things. We have to hear these rhythms, whether they're rhythms of speech, of language, of behavior. We have to see the relationship of all kinds of human behavior to the shifting grounds of morality and so forth. We must be put in touch with these things, because if we're not put in touch with these things, then who needs the arts? Then it's all television, sitcom, really. And we can't be afraid of it anymore. It's all. I remember when Old Calcutta, which I'm not putting forward as an example of this sort of thing, but although it was better than many people thought. Anyway, on opening night, there was this middle-aged couple sitting next to me, and at intermission, and you know what happens in Old Calcutta, right? At intermission, the husband turned to the wife and he said, did you ever think one day you would be sitting in a theater and this would be happening? And the wife said, it's not for us. It's for our children. It's for our grandchildren. And but we have to be our own grandchildren. You can't just stay what you are. You have to be what you are. You have to hold on to that, and then you have to venture forward from that or outward from that. And That is, to me, the real function of the arts, because we're all trapped in our lives. We're really trapped in whatever structure. For most civilized people, the only chance we have to break open walls and open windows is really in the arts. That's what they're for. That's why the cave paintings went on the wall back in the Ice Age. The same impulse, when it's legitimate, when it's free, you see, when it's not vulgarized and trapped in the bottom line or the top line or whatever. We have to know about these things. How are we going to be able to make the proper judgments, political judgments, cultural judgments, moral judgments, if we're not put in touch by artists, among others, not only, needless to say, with all of these issues? On the simplest level, last year when you had those two plays about AIDS, that was a very welcome return to some kind of theater the way it was back in the 30s, when the issue instantly got on stage with all of that fresh, hot energy, whether it was labor or whatever, and people reacted to it.
Oh, and I think it affected real social change.
Absolutely, no question about it. Well, that's one tremendously important thing about theater. And just to finish off the point, people, because I hear someone saying, yeah, well, what about pure entertainment? Do we always have to go to the theater and be in touch with this sort of thing? Of course not, of course not. Pure entertainment, this is interesting, I think. I was talking not too long ago with Glenda Jackson, the great English actress, and I said, who would you pick as an example of who, when you as a performer, really thrilled you and excited you and put you in touch with what performing is supposed to put you in touch with? And to my amazement, her answer was, it was not Laurence Olivier, it was not Robert De Niro, it was not Katharine Hepburn, it was Fred Astaire. I thought that was so interesting. And so I quoted that in a piece I was doing on Glenda Jackson. I keep coming back to my editors, and my editor said, Jack, what is this? What the hell is Glenda Jackson talking about Fred Astaire for? And I said, that's the beauty of it, that who would have expected her to pick out the greatest of all dancers, Yeah, but it's confusing. Why isn't she talking about Laurence Olivier? What?
I think we will end on that note, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.